Welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you for joining us, and a big thank you to our program sponsor, the Japan Foundation New York, for funding this series and enabling us to put this on each week. Today, we are joined by Dr. Ryo Hinata-Yamaguchi, who will be presenting on Japan-North Korea relations. Dr. Ryo Hinata-Yamaguchi is a program assistant professor at the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology at the University of Tokyo, senior non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, Indo-Pacific Security Initiative, and adjunct senior fellow at the Pacific Forum. Dr. Ryo Hinata-Yamaguchi has presented, published, and consulted on a variety of topics relating to defense and security and transport governance in the Indo-Pacific. So, Dr. Hinata-Yamaguchi, it is a pleasure to have you here with us today. I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, thank you very much. And so good evening, good morning, and good afternoon to all of you out there. So my name is Ryo Hinata-Yamaguchi, as Armani has kindly introduced me. And so first of all, I'd like to thank YCAPS, for inviting me to speak at this Getting to Know Japan webinar series. And so today I'll be talking about Japan-North Korea relations. And because I only have about 30 minutes, I'm gonna have to be very brief, and I can only sort of give you like a very rough cursory sketch of the bilateral relations, but hopefully you'll be able to sort of come away with some understanding about some of the fundamentals of the relations and some of the issues that we face. So I understand that some of you are already living in Japan or involved with Japan in some ways, okay, and some of you maybe far away from Japan, but you would have noticed that the relations between Japan and North Korea in the news and so forth are at a very hostile state. Now, this is obviously something that is not new. This is something that has gone on for many decades now. And unfortunately, the relations have gotten worse, particularly in recent years, particularly given North Korea's bellicose military behavior. But obviously there's a lot more to the relationship than just the military dimensions, and so that's something that I'll be talking about today. And so hopefully you can see slides. Amani, is it looking good? All right, so here we go. One thing that we'll also say is that although I carry various profiles and my work expands to various areas, what I'm going to be talking about today is my own personal views, and they do not represent any organization or any government. So just please just keep that in mind. However, if you do have any questions, I'll be sharing my contact details later on, and so please feel free to contact me or follow me on social media. So okay, so let me just first talk about Japan-North Korea relations in a nutshell, so that we know where we know where things are at. But the current state, well, obviously we do not have a good state of relations between Japan and North Korea, and it's not just because of the hostile stance that both countries have against one another, but it's also because there's no official diplomatic relations between Japan and North Korea. So there's no Japanese embassy in Pyongyang, and there's no North Korean embassy in Tokyo, and so forth. So that also means that there's limited communication between Japan and North Korea, not just at the governmental level, but also various other levels. And it's worsened by the fact that, for North Koreans, travel is restricted. And so therefore, North Koreans cannot freely come to Japan and so forth. There's heavy sanctions imposed on North Korea due to their bellicose behavior and various other kinds of actions. And that also means that there's minimal trade between Japan and North Korea. I cannot say it's zero, right? Because there are still some illegal transactions taking place directly and indirectly between some entities in Japan and North Korea. But at least at the official level, or in terms of legal trade, it is pretty much zero. As I said, we have limited communication. Well, we can make phone calls to North Korea, but still, again, communicating with North Koreans or North Koreans communicating with the Japanese is a lot harder than, let's say, Japanese communicating with the Americans, South Koreans, Chinese, and so forth. And also, as we've discussed before, there's this existential military threat that both states perceive, right? Vis-a-vis one another. And I'll talk more about that later on. So we have an extremely hostile relationship, but there is a lot of complex set of factors behind that relationship. It is almost wholly hostile, but still there are some exchange. There have been some exchanges, and in some cases there have been times where Japan and North Korea even were working towards having a diplomatic relationship and so forth. So again, I'll be giving you like what could be like a summary of what that relationship is about. But with anything in this world, we need context, and without context, there are major consequences. So, and when it comes to diplomatic relations or any kind of relations between states, we need to look at the historical aspects, right? So I'm just going to give you a crash course on the historical background of the relationship. But first, we need to understand the Korean Peninsula. Okay, and this is a gross summary of what went on the Korean Peninsula. But if we look at the last several hundred years, on the Korean Peninsula, we had the Kingdom of Great Joseon that lasted from 1392 until 1897. Now that later on will become what was known as the Greater Korean Empire. It was a very short-lived empire, so it's like a reformed government of some sort in Korea, and that only lasted until 1910, so it's only about 13 years old. And then the Korean Peninsula was wholly occupied by the Japanese. So the Japanese occupation would last from 1910 until 1945, but during that time, obviously there were a lot of pro-independence movements in Korea, or or pro-independence movements by Koreans, but outside of Korea. In other words, they were also working in exile. So the most known one, or the most organized one, was the provincial government of Korea. Okay, and this is what we can call like the ancestor of the current Republic of Korea, that is South Korea. But there are also many other pro-independence movements as well, with many of them being sort of like guerrilla movements, right? So small, so like militias and so forth. And one of them was run by Kim Il-sung, who's the founding father of North Korea. So the Japanese had control over Korea, as many of you know, but again, there were a lot of movements taking place to try and challenge that. So August 15, 1945, Japan surrenders, and then the Korean Peninsula is liberated. Okay, and so from 1945, state building takes place on the Korean Peninsula. However, again, this is a gross summary. Before Japan surrendered, there was an arrangement between the United States, the Soviet Union, and several other states that the Korean Peninsula will initially be initially be, I wouldn't say I wouldn't like maybe it's too far to say controlled, right? But it was like de facto control of the Korean Peninsula, Soviet Union from the north, right, or the northern half, and the United States from the southern half, right? But that was primarily to disarm the Japanese and to get the Japanese out. However, the control was a little bit stronger than many Koreans thought, and so we have a situation where we have state building on the Korean Peninsula on both sides of the 30th parallel, with conflicting ideologies and foreign influence, because the southern half will be influenced by the United States, that will be anti-communist, and on the northern half you will have the Soviet Union taking control of things over there, or influencing the state of affairs up there. And so consequently we will end up with the founding of two governments on both sides of the border. One, the Republic of Korea, that was established in August 15, 1948, right? And several weeks after that, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, that is North Korea, established in September. Okay, so the Republic of Korea in the south, Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north. So to put all this into context, right? Japan's defeat created the conditions for liberation. In other words, for the Korean Peninsula to be liberated, well, the Japanese had to be defeated, right? And the Koreans couldn't do it on their own. They had to depend on foreign powers to do that, which was the United States and Allied powers. And so we have liberation, and so liberation created the conditions for state building. In other words, well, it sort of makes sense, right? That in order for Korea to build their own government on the Korean Peninsula, well, the peninsula itself had to be liberated. But then the problem is that the state building and the unification of the Korean Peninsula, because, well, of course, both Korean governments were working to establish a unified Korean government, right? The state building and unification process was delayed by the Cold War and later on the Korean War, right? And I'll leave it to you to sort of study about the Korean War in greater detail in other sources. So that's the historical background. When you look at the Korean Peninsula, you always have to start by looking at the developments between 1945 and 1948. Okay. So what was taking place in North Korea? So North Korea, as you know, was heavily influenced by the Soviet Union, everything from the political system right down to the bureaucracy and even things like, in this at the grassroots level. Okay? But the thing is that North Korea was not just like a communist satellite state like the states in Eastern Europe, right? And in fact, a lot of the East Asian countries are like that, right? In that there's socialism, but there's also strong levels of nationalism. And so North Korea was building its nation state based on, well, Kim Il Sung's ideas, but also his own identity as an anti-Japanese guerrilla, right? So that's why you see a lot of the ideological cleansing up in the north. Also, North Korea was a lot more thorough, right, than South Korea in eradicating remnants and connections to Japan, right? So people who had connections to Japan, they had no chance of succeeding in North Korea except for the very few, right? And I'm talking about a very small portion of people. In South Korea, although this is more like an additional note, for example, the South Korean military, they were recruiting people who were veterans of the Japanese army, right, or entities that were close to the Japanese or even under the Japanese. And so North and South took different approaches to the way they were building the nation state and institutions and all that. North Korea's national identity is also shaped by Cold War dynamics. North Korea does still live in the Cold War to a great extent, right? They see things in terms of us and them, us versus them, right? The term justice in North Korea is extremely ideological, right? They'll say things like anti-imperialism, capitalism, blah 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 blah, right? You hear a lot of Cold War sort of lingua franca from the North. So that's North Korea's national identity. And so it seems like North Korea's cleansing out everything that was Japanese, but but the Japanese influence was still inevitable, right? The Japan factor in North Korean state construction was essential in many ways, in particularly in material terms, in that the Japanese, they heavily industrialized the northern half of the Korean Peninsula. Right, the southern half was more about sort of agriculture, fisheries, and services, right? But the northern half, it was more about industrialization, right? And so you had a lot of Japanese factories up in the north. The North Koreans and the Soviets sort of sabotage, right, and sort of took away a lot of machinery and so forth from the Japanese factories. But the North Koreans, where they could, they exploited those old Japanese factories. So infrastructures, equipment, and so forth. The North Koreans took advantage of them where they can. Also, bureaucratic and technical know-how that's still there. So, you have a lot of North Koreans who were working under the Japanese and so forth, or studied in Japan and all of that. And that, became useful, right? Particularly in things like factories and also to some extent in bureaucracy as well, right? In that, there are some habits, there is some know-how that they took advantage of. Also, we can't forget the movement of people post 1945. There are a lot of Japanese people living on the Korean Peninsula. Well, they returned to Japan from the Korean Peninsula. We also have Koreans who are living in Japan who returned to the Korean Peninsula. But there are also Koreans who decided to stay in Japan. Right, so there's like there's movement of people as well, between Japan and North Korea post 1945, and if we go a little bit further, right, there are even cases where pro North Korean Korean residents in Japan were actually chartered ferries and so forth to go back to North Korea in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and so forth. Another thing, Japan and the Korean War. Okay, obviously Japan was demilitarized and democratized post 1945, and Japan technically did not have a military, but they were involved in the Korean War, but in covert ways. Okay, in that we have a very small sort of Coast Guard like force that was dispatched to the Korean Peninsula for counter sea mine operations, right? It was covert, right? It was extremely secret, but that took place. So we have Japanese minesweepers off the Korean Peninsula. So they did take part in the Korean War, and in fact, there were some KIA, right, in that process. Also, there is the industrial factor in that there was great industrial demand on Japan to sort of aid to supply, right, also provide material and so forth for the Korean War to the U.S. and Allied forces or the UN forces. And that also, in turn, kickstarted Japan's economic growth. So again, just because the Korean Peninsula was liberated from the Japanese, and just because North Korea was going their own way, does not mean that Japan and the Korean Peninsula were relevant to one another. Okay. Now, more specifically to the Japan-North Korea relations. Okay. Again, this is a very gross, rough summary, but if we look at some of the developments during the Cold War, the adversarial perceptions toward one another were developing pretty fast. Okay? So for the North Koreans, a lot of the anti-Japanese sentiments were not just because of historical memories, but also because of the national identity of North Korea, right? And that Kim Il-sung, his background was like a guerrilla soldier against the Japanese. So he's going to have a lot of there's going to be some ideological factors that will shape things in North Korea against the Japanese. Also, we have a new form of nationalism in North Korea, right? That North Korea was forging their own national identity based on their own values, which is quite different from the South Koreans, right? And a lot of that's going to be, not just communism, but also just a peculiar aspects of the political party of North Korea. Okay, and so there's that identity / ideological aspect that will add to North Korea's view towards Japan or view of Japan. Then, of course, there's the Cold War dynamics. Japan is the ally of the United States, and so therefore it is, the enemy of North Korea. But also there's the other one, and that is that Japan was starting to befriend South Korea, particularly from the 1960s when Tokyo and Seoul established diplomatic relations. And so because, Japan's becoming friends with South Korea, that means that, it's like confirmed that for the North Koreans, Japan is the enemy as well. Well, what about in Japan? Japan, although maybe did not pronounce this as strongly as many of the other states, Japan was on obviously the U.S. side, right? Also the free world side, right, of the Cold War. Although I would loosely use that term. So Japan was still seeing things, more or less in this liberal democracy versus communism mind that scope, right? I guess the anti-communist stance was not as strong as many other states, like let's say South Korea or the United States, but it was still there, right? There was still an allergy towards communism, right? We have the Communist Party, we have the Socialist Party in Japan and so forth. But again, there was still a bit of a view that communist states are somewhat dangerous. Now, there was also concern about the possible domestic impact that North Korea, because there's some kind of underground or other types of connections with North Korea that Japan has, right? And I'll talk more about that later on. There were concerns that some of the ideologies of North Korea will seep into Japan, and then we'll have a domestic political impact here. So there's that concern too. In terms of security, however, at least during the Cold War, Japan did not see North Korea as an existential threat, right? The North Korean military was not shaped to attack Japan. They couldn't, right? They didn't have any proper missiles at that time, okay? And they didn't really have the capabilities to, for example, ship their soldiers and tanks and whatever onto Japan, onto Japanese mainland and so forth. So it did not see it as an existential threat, but it did see North Korea as a source of instability. In other words, they were concerned about the spillover effect. So as many of you know, the Korean Peninsula is extremely close to Japan. If you go to some parts of Japan, you can actually see parts of Korea, right? So they're worried that if a Korean War erupts again, right, and if the North Koreans are successful in sweeping the south, that means that North Korea will be on Japan's doorstep, or that there could be some refugees coming over from the Korean Peninsula, or that there could be other kinds of things that will fly over to Japan or whatever. Again, the spillover effect was the main concern. However, at the same time, as the Cold War progressed, there was also suspicion about the activities that North Korea was getting up to towards Japan, such as espionage, abductions, which I'll talk about later on, and various other kinds of things that, if North Korea is hostile towards Japan, at least in terms of attitude, then, those hostile intentions could lead to something bad. So there was always some kind of suspicion there. So this is something that was brewing during the Cold War, and obviously, there is the domestic political aspect that both countries were essentially using, one another as a way to up some threat and also to gain some political capital and legitimacy, right? There was that, and it's definitely stronger in North Korea than in Japan, at least during the Cold War. So, things were not so good, at least in terms of perceptions in very general terms. Okay. However, what's peculiar about the relationship between Japan and North Korea during the Cold War, and until I would say maybe the mid 1990s, is that there were still some exchange going on. Right, it's not as if the two were not talking to one another. They were talking to one another, but just in some different ways. So mid 1950s onward, we start to see some exchanges go on between Japan and North Korea. For example, North Korea calls on economic and cultural exchange and negotiations with Japan. And in fact, Kim Il-sung himself invited or met with some Japanese visitors, and these would include, for example, people from the media, people from the media, certain associations that would be working, that would be interested in establishing diplomatic relations between Japan and North Korea and so forth. Kim Il-sung was fairly open in that way, although of course he will have that sort of ideological filter with him. So North Korea calls on economic and cultural exchange and negotiations with Japan. Why did North Korea want this? Because they saw the economic benefits of that, right? Japan was growing fast in economic power. And so therefore, by having diplomatic relations with Japan, then North Korea will gain some benefits from that, particularly from trade and investment and various others. But also another reason why North Korea wanted relations with Japan is because this will disrupt a Japan-US South Korea pact or alliance of some sort, right? North Korea is always sensitive to close relations between Japan, United States, and South Korea, and so they felt that they had to do this in order to sort of disrupt that sort of pact. On the other hand, for Japan, North Korea is small, but although North Korea is small, there was some interest, right, in establishing diplomatic relations or trade relations at least. And although this was a sort of a small number of people, they did definitely voice their interest in a very strong way, and there was a relatively strong push for interactions with North Korea. And many of these people saw or had interest in establishing relations with North Korea, not just because of ideology, but more because they saw North Korea's economic potential. Not many people think about this, but in the 1940s and 1950s, North Korea was developing fast as an economic power, right? At least at that time, right? It was developing faster than South Korea, right? At least until the 1960s. And so many saw that North Korea's economic potential is strong and that there's something to gain from having diplomatic relations with North Korea. Moreover, right, I wouldn't say Japan was neutral, right? But Japan was not fussy about the ideological position or the nature of governments, right? Unlike pre-1945. So, they were not so, although of course there was some discomfort about communism, that didn't really stop, some of these interests to have diplomatic relations with Pyongyang. What kinds of channels were there? There were lawmakers and activists, right? Not just from the political left, but also even some from the political right who said, well, let's try and talk with the North Koreans. There's also the General Association of Korean Residents in Japan. It's a long name. In Korean, the short name is Chongyeon, right? Or otherwise in Japan, it's like Chosen Soren. But this association, how should I say, it's like an association of Korean residents in Japan who are pro-North Korean. Not North Korean citizens, but Koreans who are living in Japan, right? So first, second, third generation, who are pro-North Korean, part of this association. And so that means that there'll be pro-North Korean businesses and companies, and there are even schools and universities in Japan that are part of or associate with this association, right? So there's a pro-North Korean university in Tokyo, and almost each prefecture would have like a school that's part of this association, elementary, high school level, and even kindergarten. Also, brokers and traders were busy trying to get things going between Japan and North Korea. And also transportation, although these were chartered, there were ferries and flights going to and from Japan and North Korea. So some things were going on, although it was very moderate, right? We had trade between Japan and North Korea. We had repatriation of Korean citizens to North Korea. And we also had some grassroots exchanges. And so, tourism and so forth, from Japan to North Korea and all that. But although, of course, we didn't really have North Koreans coming to Japan for tours, right? So it's more or less one way, but there were some grassroots exchanges going on. There are also some agreements. So there's like fisheries agreements and so forth between Japan and North Korea. And so things were going on, right? It's not as if like they were not talking to one another at all. And so going into the 1990s, the Japanese government started to sort of shift its stance a little bit and said, well, why don't we get serious about establishing diplomatic relations with North Korea? Now, we are doing some things with North Koreans, and so they felt that, well, there's not too many reasons why we should not have diplomatic relations with North Korea, right? And so by doing so, Japan will have diplomatic relations with both Koreas. And so that sort of began in 1990s. And so we have consultations and discussions at sort of like working level and so forth between the Japanese and North Korean governments. However, the progress is slow. Why? Because there are various bilateral issues between Japan and North Korea, not just security issues, but also economic issues, historical issues, and various other kinds of stuff. So it's not just about politicized issues, but it's also about some technical problems as well. So there's some bilateral disagreements. And also, there were tensions on the Korean Peninsula, and there were also problems relating to North Korea's weapons program that was picking up some progress in the 1990s, and that slowed the negotiations as well. In that North Korea was clearly becoming dangerous, or the Korean Peninsula was also becoming more and more unstable. And then, despite all of that, in 2002, we actually have a summit between Japan and North Korea for the first time. Okay, so Junichiro Koizumi, the ex-prime minister of Japan, went over to Pyongyang to meet with Kim Jong-il, who was the leader of North Korea at that time. And they actually reached an agreement called the Pyongyang Declaration. Now, this was not a full-blown agreement. It was more of an agreement to work towards diplomatic normalization. So they did not normalize diplomatic relations. They just said that, okay, we promise to work together to establish diplomatic relations. So we came very close to, establishing diplomatic relations to some extent, but things reverted to deadlock. Why? Because for one, both North Korea and Japan had different interpretations of the Pyongyang Declaration. There was also domestic uproar in Japan about the fact that North Korea admitted to abducting Japanese citizens in 1970s and 80s in order to train their spies, right? And so North Korea admitted to that, and so obviously a lot of people in Japan are going to be unhappy about that and angry about that. Okay. We also have North Korea's nuclear weapons program. North Korea had cheated various deals, right, and agreements and promises. And even though it looked like they promised to not develop nuclear weapons, in fact, they were, right? And so that will set things back. From the North Korean side, they will point their finger at the Japanese and say, well, you said that, you'll work towards, so that we will work towards being friends again. We'll work towards being friends, but you ain't paying us for all the things you've done during the colonial rule, right? So North Koreans hit back as well, right? And so we go back to deadlock, and because of the situation in the Korean Peninsula and because of what North Korea is doing, we have stricter sanctions vis-a-vis North Korea and also defense measures against North Korea because North Korea has become an existential military threat towards Japan, and so forth. And so obviously things have completely frozen. So although normalization of diplomatic relations between Japan and North Korea is going to be very hard, but if they are ever going to work on this ever again, a lot of things are going to pivot on solutions to the abduction of Japanese nationals by the North Koreans, how to sort of alleviate the mutual security threat that they have towards one another, various sanctions and other various other restrictions that both countries impose on one another, and finally, from the North Korean side, reparations for the colonial past, right? And so negotiation for normalization, at one point, it was starting to pick up some pace, but then, again, we just went back to level zero. So again, I'm sort of like just rushing through all of this, but I'll be happy to answer your questions later on. But of course, we have to talk about the security threat. And so we see clear changes since the 1990s. As I said before, during the Cold War, North Korea did not pose an existential military threat to Japan, right? But since the 1990s, things have changed dramatically. well, this is not just about the revelations about North Korea's abduction of Japanese nationals, but also because of North Korea's nuclear missile threat that was developing in the 1990s. And so since the 1990s until today, we see not only modernization of North Korean missiles and nuclear bombs, but diversification. In other words, we see various types of missiles that North Korea is developing. And again, if you have questions about that, I can answer that later on. We also have Japan sharpening and strengthening its own defense strategies and readiness. In other words, Japan's also beefing up its defense readiness and strategies. And for the North Koreans, they will see that as a threat. So we have both countries viewing one another as existential threats. Okay? So what does it look like currently? Well, for Japan, Japan will be worried about North Korean attacks against Japan and United States, U.S. forces in Japan, right? Missile attacks and also cyber attacks. Also, North Korean submarines in waters off Japan that could potentially attack U.S. forces, but also Japanese forces in the waters. North Korean counter stability and espionage operations. So, in other words, spying, but also influencing public opinion and so forth. And we can just wrap this all up and just say hybrid warfare. Okay, but also there's other kinds of threats and concerns, and these are things that are actually happening right now or have been taking place for a long time, and that is a illegal transfer of technology and money to North Korea. So we have money that's being sort of laundered and all of that, but also money generated from illegal businesses or some shady businesses or sometimes even legal businesses being illegally transferred over to North Korea. We also have some technologies being transferred to North Korea, not only via internet and some media, but also things such as, for example, purchasing of cars, automobiles, various kinds of machines, right? Some North Korean Navy ships, in fact, use radars produced by Japanese radar companies, right? Like Furuno, right? Which is a company that makes radars for boats, right? North Korean Navy ships actually have that. So we have illegal transfer of technologies and money to North Korea. We also have the risk of simultaneous contingencies on the Korean Peninsula and Taiwan Strait. So Japan, as you know, is located in a very sort of tough area, right? It's surrounded by three nuclear states, or states that have nuclear weapons. China, Russia, and North Korea. And so, in particular, Japan will be very sensitive to not only the a conflict on the Korean Peninsula and Taiwan Straits, but one of the worst case scenarios is, well, what if we have contingencies simultaneously in both those areas? For the North Koreans, Japan strengthening its defense strategies and capabilities is a concern for them because it almost denies their own military leverage against Japan, the United States, and South Korea, right? In other words, they're not able to get that military edge that they used to have or that they were working towards, right? So that's one of the reasons in why the North Koreans are concerned about Japan. Okay? And second one is like an allied attack against North Korea, in that Japan, together with the United States and South Korea, could attack, well, themselves, right? North Korea. And so North Korea always had that in their mind, and right. And so this, so I'm not trying to be on North Korea's side, but if I was in the North Korean government, or if I was an officer in the North Korean military, I would be concerned about like a U.S. ROK Japan alliance or coordinated attack or operations against North Korea, because then there'll be very little chance that North Korea will survive that. Okay. So again, I'm sorry that I had to hustle through everything, but I'll wrap up now. But well, what does things look like for the future? Now, I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't sort of say, well, this is the exact scenario that we will face. But if we look at the current trends, well, it looks like conflict, unfortunately, is a lot heavier or also a lot larger than chances for reconciliation and rapprochement. Okay. And the biggest reason for this is because of mutual perceptions that, we have strong threat perceptions toward one another between Japan and North Korea. And also both governments do not see one another as credible, right? They don't believe or they don't trust one another. We also have limited political capital, right, on both sides to befriend the other, right? In that, for Japanese lawmakers or in government, right, there's not too many reasons in why they would want to have close relations with North Korea, because they just won't see that political value in doing so. And same with the North Koreans too. And also political legitimacy, in that both governments see that defending against the other party, right? So Japan, North Korea, Japan, helps their political legitimacy. Right? And for North Koreans, as I said before, this is a very important part of the national identity, right? So it's hard for North Korea to, suddenly like turn around and say, well, yeah, the Japanese are our friends. North Korean system won't allow that, right? Just by its nature, by their nature. And also animosity between people. Now, this sounds like, the North Korean people and Japanese people, like citizens, are fighting against one another. That's not the case because there's limited communication. But the fact that we have limited communication between Japanese and North Korean people at the grassroots level, that makes things hard because, there's just very little understanding of one another and so forth. It's hard to build that sort of personal bond, right, between Japanese and North Koreans when there's limited communication. And then finally, there's this tense East Asian security dynamics. The last 2-3 years, things have changed a lot, right? Not just because of the war in Ukraine, but we see that conflict in East Asia or the Indo-Pacific is no longer about ideologies. It's not about some liberal democracy versus communism, but it's more about who are the status quo states and who are the anti-status quo states, right? And so we now have China, North Korea, and Russia, who are the anti-status quo states, are causing a lot various disruptions, and also could sort of where all sorts of other kinds of undesirable scenarios could unfold in the future. And we are trying to find the US, Japan, and South Korea trying to work, and also Taiwan trying to work against that or defend against that. So we have tense East Asian security dynamics that just make things tougher. And also we have the uncertain future of the Korean Peninsula. Okay, South Korea is relatively stable, at least in comparative terms. But North Korea, although it looks stable now, and I personally believe that the Kim Jong-un regime is more stable than the Kim Jong-il regime, but still, well, what happens if Kim Jong-un pops off? Or what if some kind of coup d'etat takes place in North Korea? We are unsure about what a post Kim Jong-un North Korea looks like, right? And that's one major concern that we have, is that we could have a civil war inside North Korea and so forth. And also, what would if the two Koreas unite, right? Although this is the dream of many Koreans on both sides of the border, what would that unified Korea look like, right? Most likely, and I hope that it will be a liberal democratic state that inherits many of the values that are current ROK, but we are still unsure what that unified Korea looks like and what the East Asian security dynamics or the geopolitical dynamics look like. Okay? So again, the future it's uncertain, right? But these are some things that we have to think about going forward, right? And so again, I talked about Japan North Korea relations, and only gave you like a very rough summary of that. But if you have questions about Japan North Korea relations, or more specifically about North Korea itself, I'm open to answer them. So here are my details, or I'll put this up there for now so you can take a screenshot of this. Okay, and that's my email. And you can follow me on social media. But yeah, so once again, thank you to Whitecaps and both Armani and Gabriella for all your help. And also thank you to everyone here who's joining in on this call or this session. And I look forward to hearing your questions in your comments. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Harmony. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hinata-Yamaguchi, for that wonderful presentation. It was really, really interesting. And so to begin the Q&A session, I wanted to ask you, so to my knowledge, or something that I've come across, was actually a school that's like for North Korean children in Japan. And so I'm wondering, that's those types of schools, I'm not sure if there's a lot of them in Japan, but those types of schools, are they associated with the organization that you mentioned that's like pro-North Korean, or are they separate? Because maybe those are some students that were, their parents or their great-grandparents came to Japan, maybe after the war. I'm not sure. Like, what's the association?
So the association of those schools with like North Korea, or
Just
that's
with,
what you okay. So okay. So those schools are not run by North Korea, okay? However, they are strongly connected to that association. I was talking about the General Association of Korean Residents in Japan, very long name, right? They're, I'll say like it's like a de facto sort of affiliation, okay, there. That the General Association of Korean Residents, right? they are connected with North Koreans, although they are not sort of controlled by North Koreans. Yeah, so it's a bit of an awkward relationship to sort of describe, right? So there are connections, but it's not so like a command and control system that that comes from Pyongyang to run these schools. However, these schools, if you look at their syllabi, right, what they teach and so forth, it is very pro North Korea, right? That general association, if you look at the media, right, it's very pro North Korea, right? And so obviously, again, like the students of these schools are descendants of the people who have lived in the Korean people who have lived in Japan, mostly before 1945, but some even after 1945 who came over but have sort of strong feelings towards North Korea. Okay? Now, one thing I'll add to your question, and I'm not sure if I'm answering you here, but one of the reasons you might be curious about why there are so many people who are so pro North Korea, right? And rather than, let's say, pro South Korea, pro ROK. Now, to be honest with you, like at least even now, there is still like conflict between those two, right? Pro South Koreans, pro North Korean, Korean residents. But one of the reasons why the pro North Korean organization is larger is because they're a lot more organized, right? They're sort of the institutions and infrastructure was a lot more solid, right? That's like one explanation. Okay, so they're a lot more successful in that sort of organizational aspect. Okay, and so like again, like I'm not sure about the exact number of schools, but we do have in most cases a kindergarten, an elementary school, and high school in pretty much every prefecture in Japan, and one university. Okay, in some of the larger prefectures, right, or metropolitan areas like let's say Tokyo, right, or Osaka, we may even have like 2 or 3 or even more. Right, so there are quite a number of these schools, right? However, again, like there's a lot of controversy about in Japan about should we treat these schools as like a normal school, right? Because their syllabus is different, pro North Korea, there's that political aspect to it. So it's a very complex issue, but yeah. So I'm not sure if I answered, but I'll leave it there. It's not really my area of expertise, but I'll just leave it there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I was curious because I've seen one of those schools, and I was wondering, like, for the students that attend that school, if there's some type of protections for those students, because I realized, like, when I was a university student, my university was really close to the South Korean embassy, and always there was some type of protest, in front of the embassy. So I was curious for these types of schools that are pro North Korean, if there's some type of protection to ensure that there's no type of protest in front of these schools, perhaps just not scare the children or anything like that.
Yeah. Okay, so I can't speak to exact details because I haven't seen the precise regime or the arrangements to protect the children there. But unfortunately, there are cases where like the students of those schools are harassed and so forth, which is really unacceptable. That's just based on racism in many cases, right? And so we do have like things like harassment, like and also racism and various other kinds of unpleasant things pointed at these children. But do believe that there are some security measures taking place. You'll have like police sort of patrolling the streets and so forth to make sure that there's nothing rough. But I believe that some of these campuses are pretty secure in that you do need to have some permission to enter those campuses, right? And so like I remember I was invited to like play basketball with some friends who attend that university, right? But they said, oh yeah, but there's some security and all of that. But you have to basically go in with people that and so forth. So yeah, there is security. But again, the problem is like really about the relations between Japan and North Korea broadly, right? In that you do have a lot of children who grow up with sort of anti-Japanese sentiments, or sort of fairly sort of different ideologies, right? From what we have in liberal democratic states. But we also have a lot of students that will come out from those schools and swing the other way and say, "Look, I've had enough of that," and like and just like completely distance themselves from North Korea. So it can sort of work both ways.
Thank you so much. So to begin the Q&A session, the first question comes from DK. Although there are no corresponding embassies in North Korea and Japan, what third-party embassies or institutions are used as diplomatic channels for communication between the two countries?
Okay. And so just one disclaimer. I realize I have to be very concise in the interest of time, but regarding that question, which is a very good question, that General Association of Korean Residents in Japan, we can almost call that a de facto embassy, right? That in some cases they will be like doing things such as like processing like visas, permits, and so forth, or any arrangements in Japan and North Korea. So again, they are not. I wouldn't say that they are full part of the North Korean government, but they work very close with the North Korean government. And so therefore, they will work as the embassy. The other way around doesn't really work. We don't really have like a Japanese office in North Korea, maybe some media offices in that, but that's about it. So what happens is that you do have some communication links between Japan and North Korea, some direct ones, right? Very limited ones. But what normally takes place is that we have communication in an indirect way, for example, via the embassies in China, because both Japan and North Korea have embassies in Beijing, right? And so we have diplomats there communicating sometimes and so forth. So, there is a bit of a hassle, right, in terms of communication, but there are alternatives. But it just makes it hard because there's that, the communication channels in Japan and North Korea is very limited compared to, let's say, Japan and China, Japan, South Korea, Japan, US, but it's there.
Thank you very much. So Patricia Yarrow asked, why would Japan feel the need to be covert about deploying minesweepers on the land surface? This would be throughout the peninsula.
Okay, so we're talking about the Korean War, right? At that time, why was it covert? Because Japan was supposed to be demilitarized. Simple as that. At that time, Japan did not have the self-defense force. Okay, it only had the Coast Guard, and also again that Japan was not supposed to take part in war, right? It was demilitarized, democratized, and so forth. There are a lot of sensitivities. Even in Japan, there's they were so distant themselves from the international politics. They're focusing on rebuilding their own state. So because Japan was not part of various international regimes, including United Nations and so forth, it was this is one of the reasons in why it was covert, right? So it was pretty much working under the UN command, but in a very covert fashion. Okay. So it's really just about the political situation at that time, but also in the fact that Japan's security institution was not as established as it is now. That's also the other fact.
Thank you very much. The next question comes from Gio. How do Japan's defense budget and military modernization efforts reflect its concerns about North Korean military capabilities, especially when there is expectation that Russia will increase military technology development in North Korea?
Okay. And so the North Korea factor behind like Japan's defense modernization and also defense budget increase and so forth, that was stronger, I would say, in the 1990s and 2000s. But to 2010s onward, I would say the China factor is bigger, right? Now, one thing that I'll add to that is that Japan's defense modernization and defense budget increase is not necessarily threat-based. In other words, there are some sort of internal elements. And what I mean by that is that Japan has its own share of weaknesses, such as like low level, so insufficient amount of ammunition and supplies, right? So that's one of the reasons why there's a defense budget increase, is because they need to get those ammunition and supplies and so forth, right? So it's not all threat-based, but now it is a part of it, right? Although I would say China is the most significant factor, because North Korea is continuing to diversify and modernize their missile capabilities and various other kinds of military capabilities. Obviously, this is going to be a factor. Now, regarding Russia's military technology development in North Korea, there's a lot that we have to look for going forward, right? There's still a lot of uncertainty. I've been thrown around for the last couple of weeks about this, right? But Russia and North Korea are still very unclear about exactly how they're going to cooperate, right, in this area. This does not mean that Russia would just like give the North Koreans technology, right? What this technology cooperation could be is a situation where Russia would assist North Korea or give advice to North Korea about how to develop technologies, but also how to use and operate technologies, right? So, there's still a lot to see here, right? But if it unfolds in the way that a lot of people are talking about, well, then obviously this is going to up the level of concern, and there's obviously a lot more that Japan will be worried about regarding North Korea.
Thank you very much. So DK asked, would China ever allow a unified Korea? Wouldn't it prefer maintaining North Korea as a buffer state, especially as long as South Korea is aligned with the US and hosts US troops?
Yeah. It's definitely right. And so, just geopolitically and geostrategically, China would prefer a divided peninsula, or at least to have North Korea, right? That China, the Chinese government is not always happy with the North Koreans. They're often annoyed with the North Koreans, right? We really do, because it often disrupts the East Asian dynamics and so forth. And that many will point their finger at China and say, no, hey, you guys take care of like North Korea, or like you guys like make them behave, and the Chinese hate that. However, at the same time, although China would, sometimes slap North Korea on the wrist, right? They want North Korea to survive, right? They don't want North Korea to die, right? And that is not just because they're some ideological friends, but it's also because of, again, that buffer state, right? Or that sort of value as a buffer between North Korea, between China or themselves, and a US state, right? Or a state that is aligned with the United States. Okay, so that's definitely there, right? And I can say that the only way in which China will favor a unified Korean peninsula is if that unified Korea is pro-China, right? But yeah, so obviously the Chinese will have their own geopolitical, geostrategic interests.
Thank you very much. So Christoph Waldersee asked, thank you for this brilliant presentation. Would you be ready to share your thoughts on the recent Kim and Putin meeting? What does it mean to regard to the triangle China, Russia, North Korea? And does it have an impact on Japan and the Northeast Asian security situation?
Okay, the simple answer to that is yes. Okay, it's big. As we all know, like during the Cold War, China, well, the Soviet Union at the time did not get along, right? And the North Koreans, what they did is that they sort of were working with the country that made the big that had the best offer, right? So we had like a bit of an awkward relationship between Beijing, Pyongyang, and Moscow. Now, however, I think things are looking different in the way that I wouldn't say it's a trilateral alliance. Okay, it doesn't go to that level, and we should never view things in the same way as like U.S. Japan alliance, U.S. ROK alliance, right? It's the social states or authoritarian states work in a different way. What we have is a trilateral coordination or cooperation agreement or sort of effort based on self-interest, right? In other words, they're using one another. It is a relationship or sort of it's a relationship based on convenience, right? And based on self-interest. Okay, so I'll just put that out there first. So the Kim Putin summit, it was extremely long. It was like 10 days. Oh, sorry, Kim Jong-un's visit to Russia was like 10 days, nearly 10 days, right? What I found interesting was that his entourage included not only the chief diplomat of North Korea, but he had three types of military people with him. Okay, people who do the military planning, in other words, people who manage, right, and plan the military. Also, commanders, those operational commanders of the North Korean military, and also people from the military industrial sector, right? People who make things, right, for the military. So he had three types of people, right? I think there are like more than 10 military personnel that went with Kim Il-sung, and they would be in either of those three categories I just told you. So in other words, what North Korea is looking for is a fairly comprehensive military partnership with the Russians, right? We don't know what the details are, right? But we are likely to see some of the results of that in the coming years, right? Because what we see is that they just started, it's almost like saying North Korea and Russia started dating, right? But we don't know how long that relationship will last. We don't know how deep that relationship will be. It could be just like a short. It could be just like it could be just a very short relationship, or it could be a very long and sustained relationship, right? There's a difference between wedding and a marriage, and so there's still a lot to see. But I do see that it is quite significant in that I've never seen so much effort by both North Korea and Russia in terms of communication and efforts to cooperate, at least in the post-Cold War era, right? So I can only talk about the potential, but I would say that it's significant enough for us to sort of warrant attention to what's going to happen between China, North Korea, and Russia. But also, let's put in the China factor, right? If China also is going to pursue similar relations with both countries, and they already have, right? That creates a lot of concerns, not only for Japan, but also for the United States and South Korea, in that, again, we have a very sort of different set of dynamics than previous years.
Thank you very much. So Meg Nakano asks, what about the Japanese push for reparations from North Korea for the infrastructure and manufacturing material left behind in North Korea in 1948? Is that just a right-wing thing or?
Yeah. However, again, like the thing is that I haven't really heard. I mean, what I can say, the only thing I can really say is that I haven't really heard too much discussion about this. Is that, you know, it's something that was left behind long time ago. And it's just hard to sort of put that demand out there, particularly when it was the Japanese that built it over there. If the North Koreans requested that, well, then it's a bit different. But in this case, again, I haven't really heard any sort of serious discussions about sort of reparations from the North Korean side to Japan, or to demand from the Japanese side towards North Koreans to say, hey, look, you must pay for all the stuff that we left behind over there. I haven't heard too much about that, and I'm not sure how that will work, to be honest with you. Yeah, that's sort of out of my area of expertise, but that's what I can say. Is that I'm just not sure how that can be put together.
Thank you very much. So maybe this is the last question.
Okay.
Mark So asked, I remember explaining about the covert work, the de facto Navy, the Safety Security Force, they're known as the Coastal Security Force, for my civil military relations class. Are there other details on the SSF's work before and after they got involved in the Korean War?
Yeah, there is quite a lot. And so I can't sort of, obviously I don't have the, because of time constraints, I can't give you the whole list. And it's hard for me to produce a whole list. But what I'll say is that there are plenty of sources out there now, right, that have uncovered the sort of maritime security force developments, also naval developments, in that post-Cold War era, particularly the late 1940s, early 1950s. So there are a lot of sort of new details that have sort of been disclosed or sort of shared now. So it's a lot to exploit there.
Thank you very much. Well, I guess some closing comments, like without going into too much detail, do you have an opinion about maybe the way that Japan should approach its relation with North Korea going forward?
Okay. And I guess, like, you know, this is really affected by, you know, the line of my work, and that I sort of focus more on defense. And so, given the threats by North Korea, and given the fact that just today, right, we received the news that North Korea amended the constitution and included sort of nuclear weapons in their own constitution. So that means that North Korea is not going to give up their nuclear weapons, right? So given the way that North Korea is behaving, and given that North Korea is likely to behave going forward, and the way that they will do things going forward, I feel that, you know, North Japan does have to not only strengthen its defense, right, sharpen its strategies and strengthen its defense capabilities, but also work closely with the United States, South Korea, Taiwan, and other states that are like-minded, right, against North Korea, against China, against Russia. Okay, so I'll put that out there. At that same time, I also believe that should not come at the expense of, or that I also believe that, you know, diplomacy should also be pursued, right? In that we have to also talk with the North Koreans, not just talk at the North Koreans, but we have to talk with the North Koreans, right? And I'm not saying that, you know, there'll be a completely happy sort of solution to all of this, right? But we at least have to communicate to understand where they're at, and also to make sure that, you know, we do not have like the worst case scenario that you know, between Japan and North Korea, or any other states and North Korea, or China, and Russia, and so forth. So we do have to get communication going. The problem is that also involves a lot of effort, right, in terms to build that communication channel. So I guess, like, you know, it's like the balanced defense and diplomacy, right? That's a very important part. And also another thing is that we also have to think more about the people in North Korea, right? So, okay, the North Korean government, obviously we have hostile relations with them, and there's a lot of things that we have to do to protect ourselves from North Korea. Yeah, at the same time, we also have to find ways, or think about ways in which we can help the North Korean people who are suffering under their government in North Korea too. So that's what I'll say for now. But yeah, great point.
Thank you very much for sharing your input and your expertise with us. And thank you once again for taking time out of your day to be with us. And I would like to thank our program sponsors, the Japan Foundation New York, And lastly, I would like to present some upcoming events. So thank you once again, Dr. Hinata-Yamaguchi, for your time and for your
Thank you. Pleasure.
All right, so to present the upcoming events, so the next Getting to Know Japan webinar is going to be next Tuesday on an introduction to sake. It's going to be at 10 a.m. next Tuesday, and we have speaker Miss Louis Ann Batak Nguyen, who will be speaking for us next Tuesday. So if you have time, please join us for that. It's going to be very interesting. Next event, please. The next Community Conversations event is going to be on the role of Japan Coast Guard in armed conflicts. It's going to be on Wednesday, October 4th. This is going to be in Fusa. So if you are in the Tokyo area, please join us for this event. It will begin at 18:15 with refreshments, and 1900, the presentation will start. Captain Kentaro Furuya will be the speaker for this event. So if you have time, and again, if you're in the Tokyo area, please join us next week for this Community Conversations event. Next event, please. So the next Indo-Pacific Maritime Hour is going to be on Japan's ocean borderlands. Dr. Paul Kurtman will be the speaker for this event. This is an online webinar. It's October 10th at 8 o'clock or 2000. So please join us for this event online for the Indo-Pacific Maritime Hour. And lastly, the next Getting to Know Japan event on Thursday is going to be on Japanese pop culture, a paradoxical nature of the kawaii concept. It's going to be on Thursday, October 12th at 1900. Dr. Kaori Yoshida will be the speaker for this event. So we hope you'll join us as we talk about kawaii culture and the kawaii concept. And as a reminder, every week we have the YCAPS YouTube channel. So if you have not subscribed, or if you have not headed over to our YCAPS channel, please, add us or subscribe to us, and please check back each week as we upload the webinars from each week. If you don't have time to, if you didn't have the opportunity to attend a webinar and you want to watch it, please go to our YouTube channel. You can find it there. Of course, leave comments, turn on your notifications so that every week we upload, you'll be able to be notified when a new webinar is uploaded. So once again, thank you so much, everyone, for your time and for your amazing questions attending our webinar this week. We hope to see you next week. Once again, thank you so much, Dr. Hinata-Yamaguchi, for joining us this week. Thank you, everyone, for your amazing questions, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.